Chapters 49 and 50 of Lost a Pearl by Georgie Sheldon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 49. New-born Hopes. Richard had written almost immediately to the Earl of Radcliffe that Pearl was found, and 2 days after the events related in the last chapter he had arrived at Vannes, and with inexpressible thankfulness clasped his only and dearly beloved sister to his heart once more. It was almost like receiving the dead back to life again, and strong man though he was, he bowed his head over her and wept tears of joy. "How those dear hands have toiled and suffered," he said, kissing them tenderly. "Pearl, oh Pearl, how could you hide yourself from us so?" he added reproachfully. "Because I believed I must, that it was best. Because I was afraid of all manner of evil from him, if I remained where any of my friends could communicate with me. I was wild that day, Allstone. Oh, it was so hard, and it seemed almost as if I was accursed in the eyes of all the world and of heaven," Pearl sobbed, clinging to him convulsively. She had kept up bravely until now, but to be clasped once again in her idolized brother's protecting arms, and to realize, as she had never quite realized before, that all the wretchedness was past, was such a relief, and such a blessed assurance that all was well, that she yielded to the momentary weakness which overcame her, and wept unrestrainedly upon his breast, and confessed all the bitterness of the struggles through which she had passed. "I tried every way to find you, my darling," he said, tenderly stroking her shining head. "I advertised in all the papers—" "Yes, I know," she interrupted, smiling through her tears. "I clipped one of those advertisements from a paper and have it now. But what a strange one it was! How happened you to word it in that way? Lost a pearl?" "Because I knew that though it might be blind to all the world, yet you would understand it if you should see it. If you had but let me know where you were and what you were doing, I could have borne it better." "No, you could not, Allstone. You never would have rested, and you would not have allowed me to rest, and it would have been an additional strain upon my heart." "But I am so glad that it is all over at last," Pearl sighed gratefully. He kissed her lips fondly, saying, "Yes, dear, and now that I have you once more, I shall keep you and guard you very jealously." "Do not speak with too much assurance regarding property that is not wholly at your disposal," laughed a manly voice behind them, and looking they saw the handsome face of Richard Burnholm beaming upon them. "Ah, Richard! I suppose you will claim a share in the prize, since you found her. You declared you would, but I must confess I feared you would not succeed," replied the Earl. "I never would have relinquished the search," he answered with a determined expression. "But I have had a wild goose chase of it as it is, I can assure you. And now, having my bird once more in hand, I have no idea in relinquishing my hold until I have it properly tamed and caged," he concluded, laughing. "It will not take long to do that. The taming, I mean," replied the Earl. "But where did you get your clue to her whereabouts?" "Well, that is a long story, and I shall have to begin with my meeting with Sir Harold Cheswick," Richard answered, drawing a chair before them and sitting down. He then related how he had met the baronet, the accident which was the result of it, and the renewal of their friendship, and how he had learned that Miss Melford, who had been the companion of his child, was his Pearl. He told of their journey to Chalons, their effort to discover the relatives of Sir Harold's wife, their disappointment, their accidental meeting with his cousin Eugène at Bar-le-Duc, their visit to the little church, and the strange discovery they had there made. "It was wonderful," Richard said. "When I looked upon the names which Sir Harold had stumbled upon in the register I could scarcely believe my eyesight. The knowledge that Addison Cheetham had actually been married before he ever saw Pearl, and that in all probability his wife was living, came like a thunderbolt to me. It stunned me. It took away all my strength, and then it made such a savage of me that for the time I craved his heart's blood. For if Alice Renault was living, and we had every reason to believe that she was, he had done 2 women a deadly wrong. Although I knew if we could find that wronged wife, we could prove that Pearl was and always had been free." My joy on that account was short-lived, however, for on going down to Pelham Pines and confronting him, and charging him with his crime, he was so cool and indifferent, so insufferably insolent, that he nearly drove me wild. He committed himself to nothing, and though I had a strong hope that something could be proved against him in connection with that woman, whom every one believed to have been killed by the railway train, yet I went away quite discouraged. I can understand now why he was so cool and indifferent. He, too, believed her dead, and the matter shrouded in such mystery that no one would ever unravel it." He then went on to explain how they had met young Lord Fennelsey in London, and through him accidentally learned that Pearle was governess in his mother's family, and they had at once hastened to Vannes, where they had arrived the night of the fire. "What a strange, strange story!" the Earl exclaimed, when he had learned all that had transpired during the months of Pearle's absence. "Yes, it is a romantic one, too, though with much of sadness and misery in it." "My darling, are you not glad that it is over?" Richard asked, getting possession of the little hand that lay idly in her lap. She heaved a little sigh. "Yes, I hope we have bidden a long farewell to the sadness and misery, but," looking up at him with shining eyes and flushing cheeks, "I don't think I quite like to say that this story is all told, all over. Wait until I shall write the sequel for you. You don't know what a race I may lead you yet." "Pearle, that is like your own bright self once more. How glad you make me!" he cried, bending eagerly toward her, and reading the sweet face with the little smile of mischief dimpling it. "When shall we go back to Ashton Manor?" asked the Earl. "To-morrow," Pearle answered eagerly. "And the wedding?" whispered Richard. "No, not to-morrow," she said with a saucy glance as she beckoned Alice, who had just entered the room, to come to her. 10 days had elapsed since the fire, and Pearle's burns were now so nearly healed that Dr. Murdoch thought it would be prudent for her to return to Ashton Manor, if she desired, and the day was set for, not to-morrow, but the day after. No one could know what it cost the young doctor to grant this permission, for he knew that when Pearle went Alice would go also, since she had been invited to go home and remain with her until Sir Harold's residence was ready to receive them. George Murdoch had never dreamed, during his ceaseless, tender care of the unfortunate girl, while in her state of imbecility, that he was growing to love her with all the strength of his great heart, and he probably never would have discovered it if she had remained in that helpless condition. He would have gone on tending her kindly and faithfully, devoting his life to her, without a thought that she could ever be anything nearer to him. But when the light of reason returned to her dark eyes, when her face began to brighten and glow with intelligence, and her manner to change from its helpless dependence to sweet and matronly dignity, tempered with something of reserve, his heart pulses began to quicken, and he suddenly awoke to a consciousness of his real feeling toward her. Then the knowledge that she was a wife and her wretched husband living came to blight every budding hope within his breast. She could be nothing to him, and he had loved in vain, and every day in her presence only served to torture him, by showing him how much dearer she was becoming to him. Then that dreadful accident occurred. Addison Cheetham was dead, and Alice free once more to wed whomsoever she would. But pride now stung him with its poison-pointed arrows. She was very rich, and he, a poor struggling doctor, would be deemed calculating and presuming if he should seek to win Sir Harold Cheswick's wealthy ward, and so he set a seal upon his heart and lips, and suffered in silence. Mrs. Murdoch saw all this, and it troubled her deeply. She too loved the beautiful woman who had been so gentle and patient during her helplessness, as she would have loved a daughter, and it would have comforted her greatly if her noble son could have won her for his wife. Did Alice herself mistrust this state of things? If the lovely colour which crept into her cheeks at the sound of George Murdoch's step or voice; if her shyly averted eyes when she found him regarding her with that mournful, wistful look; if the sudden trembling of her white hand whenever he laid his fingers upon her pulse, were indications that she suspected the great love for her that grew and throbbed in his heart, then signs were not wanting to testify to it. The morning came at last on which the party bound for Ashton Manor was to leave. The hour for parting drew near, and Alice sought her friends to say farewell. "Dear Mrs. Murdoch," she said, twining her arms around the good woman's neck, and laying her lips against her cheek. "You have been like a dear mother to me, and I love you more than I can tell you. Will you come and make me a long, long visit when I am settled in Sir Harold's home? It will not be far for you to come," she added, smiling, "for you will be in London also. Yes, my dear, I will come, and I am glad that you will be so near us. But," she added, with a searching look into the fair face, "you will move in a very different circle from that which we frequent. You will have friends who are wealthy and fashionable and cultured to claim your time. But nothing can ever make those who have been so kind to me during my misfortune less dear to me. Dear Mrs. Murdoch, don't imagine that I am going to forget," Alice urged wistfully, half reproachfully. Mrs. Murdoch tearfully embraced her, and returned her fond caress with an unutterable longing in her heart. Alice then turned to the young physician, who had stood like some grim statue regarding this leave-taking, and but for the look of misery in his eyes, one could almost have believed him to have been petrified. She held out both her hands to him. He took them mechanically, and felt them tremble like two frightened birds in his clasp. "To you," she began in suppressed tones, "I owe a debt that I can never pay. But She could not go on. She lifted her tear-laden eyes to his face, and the look which she saw there broke her down completely. She bowed her head upon those strong hands clasping hers, those kind, tender hands that had done so much for her, and burst into passionate weeping. He shook like a reed at the act. "May, I cannot bear this," he whispered, and grasping both her hands in one of his, he stretched forth his right arm and drew her to him for one brief instant, murmuring passionately, "God bless you. God ever bless you, and make your future bright and beautiful." He touched her forehead with his cold lips, and then released her, but the heart against which she had leaned for that one short moment was bounding with agony and rebellion at this parting. Did something tell her what he was suffering? Did she, too, regret this separation? Again she lifted her eyes to his. There was a strange light in them, half defiant, half yearning, and her face was crimson with blushes. "I should think you were bidding me good-bye forever, you are so solemn about it," she said with a pretty little pout, and an air, an indescribable something, that made his heart bound with a wild, sweet, sudden hope in his bosom. "But," she continued, wiping the tears from her cheeks, which grew redder every moment, "I want you to understand that it is to be for only a very little while. I have no idea of losing sight of my dearest friends." It was the slightest possible emphasis that she put upon the adjective, but it was an emphasis, and it is strange how the burden began to roll from his soul, how the gloom faded from his face, and a glad light came creeping into the eyes fixed so eagerly upon her expressive countenance. Was it possible that she was holding out a glimmer of hope to him? Had she read his secret, and, understanding the cause of his grief, taken this way to tell him that she was not indifferent to his love? Her blushes certainly looked like it, her shy, sweet glances, and the little petulant tone in which she had spoken, thrilled him and gave him courage to believe that when a proper time had elapsed he might speak and tell her how dear she was to him, and she would not turn coldly from him. "Mamma, mamma, the coach has come!" And little Amy, charming in her pretty travelling suit, danced into the room just in time to break a pause that was becoming awkward to all parties. George Murdoch held out his arms to her, and she sprang into them and was hugged with a fervour that made his mother smile. He must relieve his full heart in some way, and he was thankful to the little sprite for having entered so opportunely, or he might have been betrayed into some unwise and premature expression of his feelings. He could not feel that it would be right to claim anything just now, remembering that man so lately laid in his grave, notwithstanding Alice's confession that she had neither love nor respect for her husband. He could wait. The new-born hope in his heart would keep for a while, and cheer him as he went back once more to his duties. They were all gone at last. Pearle, with Alice and Amy, Richard and her brother back to Ashton Manor, where they were all received with rejoicing. George Murdoch and his mother returned to his practice and their humble home in London, and Lady Fennelsey with her family to Dunbarton Priory. Thus the play at Vannes was played out, and all the actors had disappeared from the stage. How true it is that all the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts. 50. Pearle's happiness. All the world, all Pearle's world, rejoiced and made merry over the escape which their favorite had had from a life of trouble and misery, and looked forward with many hopes and wishes of joy to the time when she should go to reign in that beautiful home which had been prepared for her so long ago. Nothing had been disturbed at Linden Grange. The beautiful rooms had all been shut up, and the house had been desolate enough, for Richard could not endure to enter the place which he had prepared for his bride with so much of joy and hope, and which afterward had only seemed to mock him with its dreary loveliness. Now, however, the silent rooms were thrown open once more. The bright glad sunshine shone in at the windows, and danced merrily and invitingly over every beautiful thing that had been placed there by such loving hands; while Richard, his handsome face luminous from his recovered joy, superintended a few little changes and additions that were to make this home even more beautiful than it was for the lovely bride, who at last was really coming to gladden it with her presence. Pearle pleaded for a small, quiet wedding this time. "I dread a crowd," she said with a slight shiver, as she remembered the sea of curious horror-struck faces which had surrounded her on that day when she left the altar, believing herself the wretched wife of Addison Cheetham. So they let her have her way, and only the intimate friends of the two families were invited to witness the ceremony and the marriage feast. "What will you be married in, Pearle?" Alice asked one day, when such necessary questions as this were up for discussion. These two victims of a bad man's cupidity and passion had grown very dear to each other. Out of their mutual sorrow and trouble a beautiful friendship was ripening, and no topic was settled by either without the assenting voice of the other. Alice, or May as she preferred for some reason to be called now. "My name is Marie, and I like the sound of May," she said one day when Pearle had, playfully imitating Dr. Murdoch's tone, called her by that name, and so they had all gradually adopted it, was blooming into wonderful beauty. Every week added a more rounded outline to her cheek, and brought a brighter light to her eye, while ever and anon she might be heard trilling some sweet air to herself, as her busy fingers helped to fashion the pretty things her friend was to wear when she gave herself to the man she loved. "What will you be married in, Pearle?" she had asked. The fair bride-elect grew sober at the question. There was much that was painful about these things, despite her joy. Her bridal this time must not, should not resemble in the least that former mockery. "I will be married in simple white tulle," she said gravely after a long and troubled silence, "and Alice, your own deft fingers shall weave my wreath of nothing more pretentious than white violets and maidenhair ferns." "It will be lovely," Alice said. Her whole heart was in this wedding, and she could not seem to do enough for the dear girl who had given a mother's care and love to her apparently orphaned child. And so, 3 months after her return to Ashton Manor, Pearle Radcliffe went again to the church, and gave herself solemnly and reverently to the man whom she loved. The old rector's voice was tremulous and husky as he performed the ceremony, but a heartier blessing was never breathed upon a bride than that which he pronounced over Pearle when he made her the wife of Richard Burnholm. A lovelier bride every one admitted they had never seen. There was nothing of the costly magnificence about Pearle's toilette on this occasion that there had been before, but she looked far more beautiful in every way. There was an indescribable charm about her that no one had ever seen before, a sweet and gentle dignity, a calm, deep joy in her glorious eyes, and a beautiful earnestness shining through her whole face that made her exceedingly attractive. To Richard Burnholm the day was a very solemn one. He could not, in all his joy, forget that other day when every hope had been so suddenly and ruthlessly crushed out of his life, and though he had no fears now that anything could rob him of his bride, yet unpleasant memories would force themselves upon him. He was deathly white until the words were spoken that bound Pearle to him for life, then the unnatural pallor passed, and as they paused for a moment in the vestry for the registry to be brought, he gathered his wife to his heart, and laying his lips to hers, murmured, "At last, my love, at last! God make our lives one long expression of gratitude for this joy." Pearle had no bridesmaids this time, but the fair maidens who had officiated in that capacity before were all present, even to the croaker Miss Charlotte Breton, who was Miss Breton still, and with no prospect of becoming anything else. Gentle Alice Arnauld was instantly attracted toward Alice Renault, who looked very lovely in the finest and whitest of India muslins, garnished with charming little clusters of purple violets; and the two hovered continually about Pearle, their radiant faces testifying to the full sympathy they had with her joy. George Murdoch and his mother were present, as was also Sir Harold Cheswick. His gift to the bride was a magnificent diamond-studded necklace with a locket containing a life-likeness of Grace attached. Lady Fennelsey, too, and all her family were invited, but only her ladyship, with Franchita and the two younger children, responded by their presence to the invitation, although Camilla sent her kindest wishes, and joined her mother and sister in testifying their deep gratitude to Miss Radcliffe in an elegant decorated China tea service, delicate and costly enough for a prince. Pearle ignored everything unpleasant, and treated them in the kindest possible manner; and in after years, when Master Fred led to the altar the curly-haired, black-eyed niece of our heroine, a bond of perfect harmony was cemented between the two families. There was to be no tour. Pearle said she was weary of wandering, and longed for the rest and quiet of home. And so, after the sumptuous wedding breakfast had been dispatched, Richard Burnholm took his beautiful bride directly to Linden Grange. After their departure, George Murdoch suddenly missed a presence that had brightened the whole day for him, and, possessed by a spirit of restlessness, he roamed from room to room seeking it. He could not find what he wished among the guests, and passing up the grand stairway, he found himself in a wide handsome corridor, which was used partly as a picture gallery, and where a large collection of portraits and other paintings hung. He began to examine these, walking slowly down the hall. As he drew near an alcove at the end, he thought he saw the flutter of a white dress behind the crimson curtain which hung from the arch. Something instinctively told him who was there. In a moment more he had parted the drapery and stood in the presence of the woman he sought. She smiled as she said, "I have been watching the bride and groom on their way home, and wishing all manner of blessings upon them," and she pointed to the carriage slowly winding its way over the distant road; but the tell-tale blood in her cheeks, and the shy drooping of her lids, told him that she had been watching him also. "I have been looking for you, May," George Murdoch said gravely. He could not call her anything but May. It was the name that he had given her when she was nameless to him, and it was very dear to him. "For me? Can I do anything for you?" she asked demurely, while her eyes were fixed on that distant carriage. He reached down and took her hands. "Yes. You can fill my life with happiness," he said, in low, intense tones. "My darling, I have no words to tell you all that my heart contains for you; but my life shall live it if you will give yourself to me. Can you? Will you be my wife?" She looked up at him with grave sweetness, and said simply, "George, I owe my life to you." "Nay, dear," he interrupted with a glad smile, "I cannot take it as the payment of a debt." But he gathered her into his arms nevertheless as he spoke. "Then I will give it to you freely," she answered, with a sigh of content, as she nestled trustfully to him. "It is a blessed gift," he whispered, touching his lips to her forehead. Then drawing back and looking full into her eyes, he continued, "The world will say, May, that I am a fortune hunter, to seek you when I have nothing to offer you save my humble self and, perhaps, a growing reputation. Do you care?" "No, George, for I love you." And thus love laid low these most formidable of all barriers, wealth and position. "Richard, that Mr. Eugene Burnholm to whom you introduced me yesterday is very like you," Pearle said, the morning following her wedding, as they were sitting in their sunny dining room and chatting over their cozy breakfast. "He is my cousin, Pearle. And what do you think of his wife?" Richard asked, with a peculiar expression on his handsome face. "She is lovely. What beautiful hair and eyes she has! I was strangely attracted to her, and I do not know how it is, but her voice sounded familiar to me," Pearle returned musingly. "Everyone admires her. And Pearle, Eugene's wife, is Ariel." A vivid scarlet instantly flashed over the fair bride's face and neck, and tingled even to her delicate finger tips at this unexpected intelligence. Richard arose from the table, and going around behind her chair, lifted her face gently, and bending down kissed her tenderly on the lips. "I did not mean to startle you so, dear," he said regretfully. "But come with me to the library, and I will now tell you all Ariel's sad story, and why and how it was that I seemed to be guilty of double dealing." "No, Richard, there is no need. I have long been ashamed of my suspicions," Pearle began brokenly. "Darling, it is right that you should know all about it now. It is a secret no longer. Then it was, and I was bound by my word and honor to keep it." He drew her hand within his arm, and led her to the library. Wheeling a low chair into the bay window, he placed her in it, and then seating himself upon a hassock at her feet, he began. "5 years ago, my cousin Eugene, a kind-hearted but wild and impulsive fellow, first met Ariel Arkwright, the beautiful daughter of a retired clergyman. He fell desperately in love with her at once, and she returned his affection. Their courtship was ardent and short, and though Ariel's father strongly opposed the match, they were wilful, and were married in less than 6 months from the time of their first meeting. Ariel's father died shortly afterward. He had long been feeble. She had no mother, no near relatives, and was thus left entirely dependent upon her somewhat unstable husband. Eugene had no income beyond what his father supplied him. He never applied himself closely to study, and had no profession, and it was a very unwise thing for him to marry. When my uncle discovered what he had done, he was so enraged at his folly and his disrespect toward him, in not consulting him upon so important a question, that he stopped his income and sent him adrift without a penny. In his trouble, Eugene came to me, asking my advice and assistance, and I promised to aid him if he would agree to forsake all his wild ways, and be faithful to the beautiful wife he had won. He pledged himself, and I believed him to be sincere. But it was hard work to find a situation such as he was fitted for, and several months passed before any opportunity to earn his living presented itself. At last I learned that a friend was going abroad and desired a clerk. I applied for and succeeded in obtaining the situation. But the salary was small, though my friend promised to increase it if Eugene proved himself efficient. It was a great trial that he would have to be separated from his wife for a while, but he could not take her, and I told him that I would assume the care of her while he was away. I hired that little cottage which is called the Dovecot, furnished it for Ariel, and supplied her with a servant. There her little one was born in less than 3 months after her husband went away. In the meantime I discovered that he had been guilty of many indiscretions. There were debts of honor to be paid, and many other bills were presented, of which he, I suppose, had been ashamed to tell me. I felt that money was no object if I could do anything to encourage and help make a man of him, and I paid everyone, but kept a strict account of everything, and of the household expenses at the Dovecot, in that little book which you saw. The poor child, his wife, so alone and so young, clung to me as if I had been her brother; and indeed she was so sweet and lovable that I was not long in learning to regard her as a dear sister. I went often to see her, and gave her every comfort which I could crowd into the little house; but I had to do all this secretly, for Eugene had made me promise that no one should know where his wife was until he could return and give her a suitable home of her own. He proved himself a valuable and trustworthy clerk. My friend became deeply interested in him, and through his influence Eugene has now obtained a situation in London that renders him independent, and he is as happy as a man need to be with his lovely wife and beautiful boy, whom they both insisted in calling Richard, out of gratitude to me." "How simple it all seems, now that I understand it," Pearle said with a sigh. "Where did your cousin first meet his wife?" she asked after a moment. "In France, during one of his wild races over the country. They were living there for a time on account of her father's health, and she and Eugene were married in the very same church where Alice Renault was wedded. Ariel in some way lost or destroyed her marriage certificate, and when she found that her husband was returning to England, she wrote, insisting that he should go to Bar-le-Duc on his way home, and bring her a copy of their marriage record. And so it happened that we met him there, and in that way discovered the record of that other marriage." "How strange it all seems," said Pearle meditatively. Then putting her white hands upon her husband's shoulders, and bending so that she could look into his face, she continued, "I am proud of my noble husband. Dear Richard, forgive me for my unreasonable suspicions of you—" "Hush!" he interrupted, laying his fingers playfully upon her lips. "I do not wonder that you suspected me. A less suspicious person would have believed even worse than you did under the same circumstances. How you must have suffered, my darling, that night when you followed me to the Dovecot! But let us not dwell upon those days. Let us forget the past in the bright present, and what it promises for the future. If we have lost a year, we will try to make the most of those to come." "The year has not been lost," Pearle returned with grave sweetness. "I believe I am far better fitted to be your wife now than I was before our trouble overtook us. If my happiness had been secured then, if everything had been just as we wished, I fear I should have lived selfishly and thoughtlessly all my life. Now I have seen and realized something of the sorrow there is in the world, and the need there is that every one should contribute out of his or her life to brighten that of others. My lesson in adversity has taught me that God, not self, should be first in our hearts, and that to do good and deal kindly with those around us are duties which we owe to Him." 6 months after the wedding at Ashton Manor, there was another at Sir Harold Cheswick's residence in Hyde Park Corner, London, where he gave his adopted daughter into the care of George Murdoch. Years have passed since then, and Alice Renault reigns in her elegant home a loved and honored wife. Her husband has attained fame and reputation as a skillful physician, and is now employed in families where once he would not have dreamed of being allowed to enter. His mother, a sweet-faced, silver-haired old lady, vibrates between the nursery and the schoolroom, and is never more content than, when the day is over, she gathers their inmates, a George, a Margaret, pet named Pearl, and a little Harold, together with the more sedate Amy, around her, to relate some wonderful story of that mystic long ago, when she was young. Sir Harold, too, has his bright corner in this pleasant home, and often declares the best investment he ever made was when he adopted this charming daughter upon that eventful day at Vannes. In Richard Burnholm's home there is an Alice and an Allstone; but the chief charm of that circle is in the gracious matron whose sweet and self-denying life, whose devotion not only to her own family, but to the interests of all around her, has drawn all hearts to her with a love and reverence that will long outlast the years of her life, and then rise up to call her blessed. The End of Lost, a Pearl, by Georgie Sheldon. Recorded by Celine Major. Thank you for listening.